Welcome to World History with Mr. Giese. In this episode, we will be discussing the weapons and battles of World War I. At the end, you'll be able to describe the different types of weapons that were developed because of trench warfare, the early battles of World War I, and the role that women played at home and at war during this time period. As we discussed in the previous video, in the Battle of the Marne in 1914, both sides started to dig trenches to develop cover for the soldiers that were fighting. As both sides did this, the war became deadlocked in a bloody stalemate. Trenches, for both sides, was a miserable existence, with everything from trench foot, lice, and rats. In order to engage the enemy, soldiers would have to cross no man's land. This was the section between the two opposing trenches. Each side had built up obstacles to slow the attacking soldiers down, so now that these trenches were in place, the line became very difficult to move and each side started looking for any advantage to fighting this style of war. The different types of weapons used during this time was to eliminate soldiers' lives being lost in no man's land. One of the weapons was poisonous gas. This gas could blind, choke, or burn its victims. However, one shift in wind direction could cause the gas to go where it was not intended. Rapid-fire machine guns and artillery with high explosive shells were also developed to help attack the enemy's trench. Another advancement in technology was the tank, although they did not make a huge impact until later in the war. These tanks could cross no man's land and provide cover for soldiers. The number of planes increased as both sides saw an opportunity to attack from the sky. Pilots started to attach machine guns and bombs to the plane, extending their usefulness. Although these technological advances occurred, the fighting in trenches still existed. Some of the early battles did not go very well for the Allied powers. In 1916, at the Battle of Verdun, Germany's plan was to assault the French at the Palace of Verdun. The impact of this loss would stun the French, and they would protect it at all costs. Therefore, the Germans planned to kill or injure as many soldiers as possible, or to bleed France white, to deplete their army, said a German commander. The French would suffer 400,000 casualties. In order to distract some German forces from Verdun, Great Britain launched an attack with the Battle of the Somme. Again, the Allies took a heavy toll and would suffer 60,000 casualties. A year earlier, in the Gallipoli campaign, the Allied powers looked to gain an advantage in the Dardanelles to be able to ship resources to Russia. However, the Ottoman Empire was not as weak as the Allies thought, and again, they were defeated. Prior to this, however, Japan did form a military agreement with Great Britain by declaring war on Germany in 1914. This allowed Japan, on the other side of the globe, to capture German colonies in China and the Pacific. While the war was being fought, most men were serving their countries as soldiers. In order to keep up with the demand of resources for the front lines, women would have to fulfill a different role than society had allowed up to this point. Women now were working in the factories to be able to produce goods and resources that were needed to fight. Women were even working with the army as nurses to help injured soldiers. As this started to become more present, public views of women started to change. Seeing the role that women played, they were allowed to vote in some countries. As both sides looked to find an advantage over the other, during the early stages of the war, the Central Powers looked to have the upper hand, but these victories would not continue.